So to begin, first thing I want to talk about is just kind of this brief review. This is going to be a very quick history of water development in Arizona in the 20th century. And then I want to go into ecological sciences and natural resource sciences, two different perspectives of sustainable natural resource development. Using one of those approaches that were used in northern Arizona, I want to share some information from a case study that I've been working on since about 2005. And then considering all those things together, hopefully I'll be conveying something about what it says our potential future is as we continue to grow in the way that we have. All right, so if I decided to use these postcards because the pictures can tell. If pictures really do share 1,000 words, then these are pretty insightful as far as Arizona's values in the 20th century. So to begin with, Phoenix has received a lot of attention and has been well documented. Their success in the growth in the 20th century has been very well documented. Like, as you may know, they were extremely successful in transforming the local policies, but like a lot of cities in the West, by the mid-20th century, they had sort of exhausted their local energy and water resources. What they needed to do was to get natural resources that were available regionally, but most of those resources were on public lands or Indian reservation lands, which are held in federal trust. They didn't have access to those, so what they set out to do, boosters in Arizona, was to transform federal Indian policy and transform federal natural resource policy. Now, the Colorado Plateau, at that time, and again, this is like the post-war period, the Colorado Plateau was largely was largely undeveloped in the industrial sense, and at the time it was inhabited primarily by a number of tribal communities. At that time, there was no real robust environmental policy. What else? Oh, and it was thought at the time that the termination of the federal reservation program was coming. So the idea was that as the reservation systems were terminated, these lands, these resources would be made available for energy development. As it turns out, very few reservations were terminated, but the metropolitan communities in the West got access to the resources anyway. And a lot of that energy is developed in Indian lands. So, relative to Phoenix, if you've read or you know of Charles Wilkinson's book, Fire on the Plateau, you're probably pretty familiar with this already. If you're not, Black Mesa, Arizona, in the northeastern part of the state, it was really central to what Wilkinson called the big buildup on the Colorado Plateau. Black Mesa, you can see the coal mine there, Black Mesa Cancer coal mine. Historically, it's two contiguous coal mines. You can think of it as one area, but it's split in half. Half of the coal was shipped via coal slurry pipeline, 273 miles, to the Mojave Generating Station in Laughlin, Nevada. The Kansas coal mine shipped its coal exclusively to the Mojave Generating Station via two automated electric trains that run 24/7 all year round. As you also probably know, the primary reason for development in the Navajo Generating Station was so that we could create electricity with the Central Arizona Project. And as well, part of the energy that was used for the Mojave Generating Station was used for pumping water to Southern California. It's a little more difficult to know exactly how much energy was used for that purpose, but it certainly was. Now, just so you understand exactly how massive this infrastructure was just to get water to Phoenix, take these things into account. The Colorado River Basin Project Act of 1964 authorized development of Central Arizona Project. This is the largest and most expensive canal on Earth. It is Arizona's largest source of renewable water, and it's the largest consumer of energy. When it was built, the Navajo Generating Station was one of the largest power plants on Earth. It's still the largest in Arizona and the largest on the Colorado Plateau. Black Mesa Kansas coal mine, up until 2005, was the largest open pit coal mine on Earth. Peabody Western Coal Company, again, as far as economic size goes, the largest private sector coal company on Earth. And the mine also supplied the Mojave Generating Station via the only coal slurry pipeline on Earth. Now, this system is fine if this is sustainable. It's a win-win. Metro communities get the water and energy they need. Tribal communities get direly needed revenues they need. Whether or not that's sustainable is kind of a matter of opinion. Andrew Needham explained that this big buildup, it was a fundamentally political project in which metropolitan representatives claimed authority over distant lands and resources. The Sunbelt cities became imperial entities, and the tribal lands became the energy colonies. Now, last part of the history lesson here. Just to note, Charles Wilkinson was the individual who discovered that the lawyer representing the Hopi tribe, who negotiated the lease agreements with Peabody, was actually on the payroll for Peabody at the time he was negotiating with this. Okay. A quick lesson on natural resource development. There are two general perspectives of natural systems. The first one being nature's balance that we all sort of grew up with. And that's that idea that nature is, or a natural system or an ecosystem or the global biosphere is usually in the steady progress towards its optimal equilibrium or its balance unless it experiences some kind of disturbance, and then it's knocked off. And once the disturbance is removed, it sort of moves back in that direction. The way we manage those systems, we model those systems, right? We do this for economic systems, ecosystems. This is kind of how we do everything. And this is based primarily on economic linear equilibrium theory. This isn't really based on how natural systems work. We model the systems, we simulate the systems, and based on the model simulations, we determine how we can predict and control that. This process is embedded in federal policy. The Environmental Policy Act requires that we do this. The National Environmental Policy Act, requires that we do this. Better, more recent understanding is that all natural systems, complex social ecological systems, are far more complex than that. They're always in a state of flux. Stochasticity is sort of the norm. Their complexity sort of precludes our ability to really model them correctly. And this is important. This is the important thing. The more humans attempt to control those systems, the more vulnerable they become. So there's this saying in social ecological system research that increasing engineering resilience, the more controls you put on it, diminishes ecological resilience. Now, there's also been a very well documented what's called the pathology of natural resource management. When you take human controls and you impose them upon a natural system, a complex system, you try to keep certain variables in that system stable. Our whole purpose for doing this is stabilizing the system so that we can create a reliable supply of a certain resource. That pathology has 5 very well understood stages, and it progresses like this. Initially, development is perceived as successful. Initially, no harm, no problems are perceived or encountered. Most agencies become, management agencies become increasingly rigid if it's successful by managing. Economic sectors become increasingly dependent upon development, meaning those communities adjust to the revenue stream created by that development. Ecosystems become increasingly fragile. This is something that we usually don't perceive. It happens over long periods of space and time. And when adverse impacts are perceived, those that were unexpected or thought were explained to be preventable, the public loses trust in governments. Now, when the problems occur this way, when we run into those problems, we end up creating other technological or economic interventions and impose them on the system to fix those problems that we didn't expect. So we're using more technology to fix the problems that the similar technologies created. This creates a recursive loop of endless problem solving over time. And it's also a ratchet effect. Over time, the system becomes more and more vulnerable. Now, Jen, how much time do I have? Really? Okay, I gotta scoot. Okay, to the case study. This is not showing up right here. I just lost my PowerPoint. Oh well, okay. Nonetheless, since mining commenced operations in 1968, there has been this sort of ongoing conflict. Residents who live on Black Mesa have very consistently voiced their concern for declining groundwater quantity, water levels dropping, groundwater quality may be degrading. There could be associated losses of biodiversity from wetland losses, cultural continuity, subsidence, all kinds of things. Now across the board, Peabody and OSM, who's the lead regulatory authority of the mine, has said that the mine has caused no impacts, and any adverse impacts to groundwater is caused from increasing tribal pumping or recent drought. Now, if you have the time, you're kind of a nerdy guy like me, you can go back and collect all the policy documents that were required for development. All of these things were required to get a permit for mining through time. All of these have various predictions in them regarding how bad certain impacts will be to like groundwater volume, groundwater quality, etc. When you collect these and you look at what the predictions were over time, it kind of tells you a story. It tells you what's been going on there. And so what I did is I collected these things, I outlined all the predictions, I evaluated those predictions, and this is some of the information that I came up with. Long story short. So pre-development, back in the 60s, early 70s, projections were that the mine would never withdraw more than 3,200 acre feet in any single year, would average 2,400 acre feet. I gotta speed this up a little. And this shows you what the predicted withdrawals were versus the actual withdrawals over time. Now, I want to show you, I highlighted 1985 there in green. Just keep that in mind. The mine stopped pumping groundwater for 6 months. And I thought perhaps that data point might show up later. Looking at recharge. Again, before mining commenced operations, the hydrologist said that we're only going to take 3,200 acre feet per year, and Black Mesa gets 235,000 acre feet of natural recharge, just water that percolates back into the aquifer. 235,000 acre feet every year. So no problem, this is sustainable. That should have set off some red flags, because that's a tremendous amount of recharge. In 1997, the USGS did an evaluation as well, and they said, no, recharge is more like 2,500 to 3,500 acre feet per year. So let's assume the USGS geochemical analysis is correct. The gray areas, Peabody's pumping through 2005. Best case scenario, if recharge is 3,500 acre feet, then there's about 19,000 acre feet that hasn't been recharged. Just in a sort of linear approach to groundwater management. This is not the way to manage groundwater, by the way. It's called the Safe Yield Water Budget Management. Worst case scenario, if recharge is 2,500 acre feet per year, that means there's about 53,000 acre feet that wasn't recharged in the aquifer. Now, as far as groundwater volume, the N aquifer is actually a very deep aquifer. It's the third aquifer down. And they said that they wanted to keep the water levels above the top of the N aquifer. And they said at no time will water level drop to below the top of the N aquifer. The closest it can get is 366 feet, and that would happen until the year 2052. In actuality, in 2008, the water was 9 feet below the top of the aquifer. So theoretically, the water, the aquifer's at risk of compaction there. Everything that's above it crashing on top of it. The particular well we're talking about here is at Kayenta, about, as the crow flies, 16 miles northeast of the mine. And in 1990, OSM said that, well, Kayenta's pumping is causing about 96% of that decline. That's not caused by the mine. So I did my own little evaluation here. The chart on the left basically says, and this doesn't make any sense, but the chart's not statistically significant, so that's why. It says the more groundwater Kayenta pumps, the more the water rises. And that doesn't make any sense, right? So something is skewing that data so much, and one might surmise that, well, maybe the mine is influencing it. Oops, the same chart with the mine on the right says the more they pump the mine, the more the water at Kayenta declines. And there's one little data point there that sticks out. It's a statistical outlier, and that happens to be 1985. And again, OSM has continued its statement to this day, actually. I sat across the table from them, and they said, no, absolutely not. Kayenta's causing the decline at Kayenta. And I said, well, look at this chart. They don't look at the charts. They just kind of repeat the issue. The president of Peabody back in 1994 just basically saying in an op-ed to the LA Times, we're not causing groundwater depletion, it's drought or increased pumping. And OSM saying the same thing, but this is what's interesting. You see, this is just cherry picking the data. This is in 2011. And they're citing data that stops, monitoring reports that stops in 2005. There are monitoring reports every single year. Sometimes they're a little late, but there's at least 5 monitoring reports there. Oops. Okay. So why did they do that? Well, ending in 2005 was the last year, they actually used logarithmic charts. Meaning that the units measure on the left, they're not incremental, they're not even, they're larger and larger and larger. But using this chart, it didn't look like there was a decline. If you take the same data and look at the particularly for the string I'm talking about, put it on an incremental chart, it looks like that. Beginning in 2006 until today, USGS had says consistently there is a declining trend in this spring. But OSM, who is a lead federal regulatory authority, who is in charge of protecting tribal interests, has said there's no problem. The groundwater model. There isn't time to go through this. In 2008, OSM began using a groundwater model made by Peabody to create simulations for its environmental impact statements and such. It's obviously a conflict of interest there, but OSM doesn't think there is. If there are the 10 commandments of groundwater modeling, this model breaks at least 8 of them. There isn't time to go through it now. We'll talk more about it later if there's time. But so out of a lot of analysis and a lot of evaluation, I didn't see any predictions that were accurate in this stuff. And I did see a very consistent pattern that whenever the regulatory standards were being surpassed, or the damage standards, OSM changed the material damage criteria. 21st century. Here's what we know, and I know you know this, but beginning 21st century, here's what we know about what may happen in the Southwest. It's going to get warmer and drier, increasing drought intensity and duration, increasing severity of wet periods of flash floods, increasing forest fires, decreasing flow in the Colorado River. I've seen now reports up to 30%. Usually they say it's into 20%. Same time, population growth. And you've seen this is Bureau of Reclamation. And the blue area is essentially what they think the average flow in the river is. But that's actually going to start going down. So the use may go down a little while, but it'll keep going up if population grows. use will go up, but the supply will go down. So the problem is a lot worse than it used to be. Nonetheless, even within the state and at the state universities, this is a report that came out from the Morrison Institute here. It's basically reassuring. This is the Sun Corridor, and the Sun Corridor is essentially this idea that everything between Tucson and Phoenix and Prescott will fill in as one sort of megapolitan area, just the way San Diego and Los Angeles has. This report concludes that 9 to 10 million is sustainable. Let's see. So in short, this is sort of what we have now, but we're going to transition to something like this, and this isn't exactly correct, but it's close, just to give you an idea. And there's certainly no lack of research going on to how we're going to deal with this. And publications and cataloging, well, our adaptive capacity and our potential to cope with all of this stuff. Here's my point with this though. This is still supply-demand logic. This is linear logic. This is more technological and economic interventions. There is no discussion. I don't hear any discussion about whether we want to progress towards becoming the Sun Corridor. It's just asking the questions, will we have the resources we need and how are we going to get them? That is the only discussion I hear.
Yeah.
Even in these reports, from the federal government, the state government, and the universities. These options are all needed, they're all necessary, but these aren't going to fix it. These will actually reinforce the status quo. These are to maintain them. No time to talk about SP2109, we can talk about that in the end. To sum this all up, I think there are two conversations. The problem, as I see it, there are two conversations about sustainability going on in Arizona. They're occurring simultaneously, but in different places, by different people. And the people in the north aren't too concerned with what the south is concerned with. The people in the south, I don't hear anybody talking about our sustainability is dependent upon their sustainability. What's my point? You kind of get my point already. And again, I will say this, Arizona water managers are using the language of resilience, but they're implementing the methods of the status quo. I wholeheartedly believe this. And following along with what Andrew Ross said in his book, Birds on Fire, people usually say, well, this group of people, they exceeded their carrying capacity. The Hohokam. That's what they did. That was the problem. Andrew Ross is saying, not really. There's something before that. They had a lot of social decision-making that led up to how they're going to implement those technologies and how they're going to manage their societies and what they're going to do with their resources. It's the social decision-making that didn't provide them, didn't carry them through in the times that they needed them to. I think that's what's going on now. I think we have social decision-making to account for before we implement more techno-economic controls. Okay, so last two slides. Sorry. We started with this, but I kind of wanted to, this is this linear logic, but I kind of want to transition this. We started with the 21st century, 20th century. If you just put the 21st century there, I think this is what's going on. Intensifying reliance, I mean, this is where we are now. I think this is the plan, this is all I've read. Intensifying reliance upon techno-economic interventions as we brought up the Sun Corridor. This will reinforce metropolitan dependence on tribal resources. It will reinforce tribal dependence upon revenues from natural resource exploitation, tightening the ratchet effect, and leading us to a very scary, more vulnerable future. I do not think it is, as far as water management goes, I do not think it is a more resilient future. I do not think it's more sustainable. I think it's more vulnerable. We'll leave it at that. Sorry, LaDawn, for going over.
Dr. LaDawn Haglund, who is coming to us from South Africa, where she's doing research on this right
LaDawn, take it away.
Are you gonna give me a video screen so I can see where you are on the PowerPoint?
I don't think we have that capability, unfortunately. So we'll just do it by instinct.
It was on before, it was working when you had his presentation until I got disconnected.
Just a second.
Okay. Hi.
Hey,
Is that okay?
so do you want to, I don't think we can share a screen.
No, you don't have to. Just put the PowerPoint on. It was working before. I don't know why. When
So you can share the PowerPoint.
We did it before and then we lost
Then go to
her.
full PowerPoint screen.
but you just didn't you just have his on full
We
PowerPoint?
did, yeah, and you can see his?
Yeah.
Okay, let's try that one.
No, not that one.
Not share screen?
No.
What
Just
do you
put it
want?
up on the screen behind you.
Okay. That's all. So can you see that?
I certainly can. Well, I can see the bottom right-hand corner of it.
You probably know the slide well enough.
Well, I have another copy of it here on my computer, so. Anyway, so hello everyone. I don't know who's there, and I can't see you, but hello. I'm just going to talk for a short while because, as you can see, the technical difficulties are kind of extreme. And so I don't want to take any chances that I'm talking too much and I kill our connection for some reason. So I just want to give you a real quick overview of what I'm doing in South Africa. And also what I do in Brazil and what I will be doing in India. I'm not going to talk about India at all. I'm not going to talk about Brazil very much, but I'll tell you a little bit about what's happening in Johannesburg, especially because there will be a video playing during the Q&A that has a lot of images from the West Rand gold fields, which are here in the Johannesburg area. And they show very clearly what the consequences have been of mining. I'm sorry that I didn't hear the previous presentation, except for the first couple of minutes, so if I am repetitive in any way, shape, or form, I apologize for that. Jen, you can go ahead and go to the first slide. So just to give a little bit of background, there's 3 bits of background that I want to give. One is colonialism, the second is capitalism, and the third is urbanization. So starting with colonialism, a lot of you probably already know this, but colonial history is characterized by resource extraction as one of the biggest reasons that colonization happened in the first place. And so can you put the first point down there, Jen? Yeah. So exploitation of resources, but it wasn't for the benefit of the population in the colonized area. It was for the benefit of the colonizers. Number 2 is that in that process, there was also exploitation of local labor, meaning that social relations were switched around in ways that made it impossible for local populations often to continue with whatever they had been doing for their economic well-being, and they began to be exploited for the benefit, again, of the colonizers. And then the third is that the folks who did not fit into this particular model, a model of enrichment of the poor, were marginalized. And the point of going over this, if you want to know more, you can take my class in the fall on globalization and economic justice. But for now, these colonial legacies reproduce themselves across generations. Marginalized people often carry that marginalization through their children and their grandchildren. And that has led to a perpetuation of injustices in many parts of the world today. That was the last point, yeah. Just one other little quick point about that, that most of the world was colonized. If you don't know that, I didn't put a map of that, but there are very few parts of the world that were not touched by colonialism in some way, shape, or form. Okay, next slide. So, hang on one second. So the second piece of the background is modern capitalism. And, you know, though, as I mentioned, elites were able to benefit from advantages that were inherited through generations, that's not the only place where injustices come from, obviously. Elites also are able to wield power through capitalist social relations of production and consumption. And often their power depends on control over resources. So again, we're coming back to resources. And today this has to do with things that not only colonizers consume, but that we consume as well. So some of these things we have a choice in consuming, like whether we're going to buy the next new smartphone or how many vehicles we're going to own, etc. And other things we don't have a lot of choice. For example, water. Everybody needs to consume water. But what's important to note is that control over these resources gives power to certain and rather small groups of people. And on the last point, both of these kinds of consumption have environmental impacts. And sometimes they're contradictory with each other, but regardless, they have environmental impact that has to be taken into account. So our consumption here, if I were sitting in the room with you, that would be here, impacts what happens there, meaning where I am now in South Africa or in Brazil or in other parts of the world. The here and the there are deeply intertwined in our modern world. Next slide. Okay. So let me just give you the example of mining. I think you've already been talking a bit about mining, but almost everything that we consume today contains minerals. But mining is not an activity that doesn't have consequences. So for example, in Johannesburg, the next point, the environmental impact of mining has been extreme. Mining is the first industry that, it's the reason that Johannesburg even exists. There was mostly pastoral inhabitants in this area at the time when minerals were found here, and the minerals drew large numbers of settlers, and that was the founding of Johannesburg. It grew very rapidly, and the damage from this mining is incredible. You will see some pictures later in my presentation. You'll also see them in the video that follows the presentation. The problem here for water is that the acid mine drainage dissolves heavy metals like uranium, cadmium, lead, zinc, all kinds of nasty stuff from the mine dumps. And this acid mine drainage enters directly into surface and groundwater. And as of today, there is no really good cleanup efforts, and there are no really good ways of preventing this from happening. Mining also has a social impact. That contamination actually has created very severe health problems for the population, and it has also led to a great deal of conflict. There's not a lot of other economic activity, and so even when mines close, you have very poor people going into the mines and trying to extract whatever resources they can, and sometimes getting into shootouts with each other. So these are some of the impacts of mining. In the next slide, you can see that mining is not really considered a negative if you just look around at the billboards. Mining is a major source of economic growth in South Africa, and the costs associated with it are not calculated negatively in the GDP, which does, if anybody doesn't know, the gross domestic product. So growth is enhanced by mining, but all of the negative consequences of mining are not accounted for. So when the companies and the government talk about mining, they talk about it in very positive ways. As you see in the signs, African mining is the deal of the year. And you see in the second sign, adding value to natural resources, Sasol, investing in South Africa's success. And the framing is as if the natural world doesn't have value without Sasol's intervention. And the consequence of this is that these companies and these banks are able to benefit a great deal from the extraction of resources. But it's the state and the communities that are left to deal with many of the consequences. So there's a classic case of privatized benefits and socialized costs. Next slide. So the last piece of the background I want to put forward is the urbanization piece. Urbanization, which has increased dramatically over the last generation, has had an incredible impact on the use of natural resources. The resources that flow into urban areas often don't originate there, and the wastes that flow out of cities often impact those who don't benefit directly from the use of those resources. And as with all social relations that concentrate wealth and power, urban expansion has meant more costs for marginalized populations, both urban and rural. And so bringing together all three of these pieces this is what motivates my research, which is the next slide. So we have these intense conflicts over historical marginalization that has continued today, extraction of resources, and rapid urbanization with all the demands and complexities that come with that. And so in my current research project that has brought me to South Africa right now, one of the interesting pieces of this is that law has begun to people have started going to courts to try to solve some of these problems. So environmental law has been, in all of the countries that I'm looking at, has increased dramatically. Also the use of human rights language, both discourses and practices vis-a-vis social injustices has increased greatly, including embodiment constitutions. I'll talk about that in a sec when I'm talking about the cases themselves. But it's unclear if courts are actually up to the challenges that I've laid out, because courts are very slow moving, they're very set in their ways, if you will, and so it's an open question whether this greater use of courts is actually helping. And there's the added complexity that there's an actual potential conflict among different policy objectives. So for example, providing more and more water for urban residents while trying to preserve the water that is necessary for the ecosystem. Next slide. So Brazil is one of the cases. I'll just quickly talk about some of the things that are happening in Brazil so it provides a background for South Africa. Brazil has problems with deforestation, with incredible urban pollution. As you see in the bottom left picture, this is a favela, which is a slum area that is next to a luxury condominium, and you see that there are jacuzzis on every patio of this condo, and in the favela next door, there's no water. And then the poverty is very extreme as well. So there are really severe challenges. The next slide this is what has happened in Brazil to try to to address some of these rather dire consequences. In the 80s, there was a transition from a military government to a democratic government. And in 1988, they created a new constitution within which a lot of the neglected issues were embodied as rights, such as housing, health, education, etc. All of these were named specifically as having human rights legal status. At the same time, existing environmental laws and regulations were strengthened. I think you're a couple of points behind me. There you go. So the existing environmental laws and regulations were strengthened. Though they weren't linked to human rights, they are much stronger than they were prior to this. So all of these shifts gave people a lot of hope that there was going to be a broader social transformation. But it hasn't been as smooth as they would have hoped. Some of the obstacles to this transition have been, and I'll go quickly through these, historical rifts among classes. There's incredible class differences, and it's hard to get people on the same page about social policy. There's also a real reluctance of state actors to challenge the economically powerful actors. In particular, for São Paulo, the city that I study, its developers. They have, in recent decades, it's been mainly developers, although industry has also been very strong. Another problem is that policies don't always have commensurable goals, and so they might conflict each other. The next point is that there's a lot of legal formality in the Brazilian legal system, and this has not been very flexible or adaptive in terms of the complex challenges that São Paulo presents. Even when everyone is on the same page, there's a lot of fragmentation within agencies like the legal system, the lawyers, the Attorney General's office, and among agendas. And the final point is that citizens, although seemingly empowered by this new constitution, have a real ambiguous relationship with the legal structures because there aren't a lot of ways for them individually or as groups to enter the legal system and to try to fight for some of these human rights and environmental rights. But there is a silver lining in that the Ministerio Público, which is like the Attorney General's office, is a very powerful mechanism of accountability. And they have been very active in trying to promote some of the rights that are embodied in the Constitution. Moving to South Africa. South Africa also has extreme challenges. Some townships are in very bad conditions still. 20 years after democratization, hasn't done much. Water is a serious issue, getting water to communities. This is a standpipe from one of the communities that is on a mine dump that is in the video that you will see. The mining is the third really complicated challenge that faces the water sector in Johannesburg. And then finally, the legacies of apartheid have not ameliorated much at all. As you can see in this graph, the African population is still severely deprived in relation to the other populations, and in particular whites, who have actually benefited quite a great deal from the end of apartheid. So, to compare South Africa on some of the same points to Brazil that I just mentioned, next slide please. In South Africa, the dismantling of apartheid had some similarities to the democratization in Brazil in the sense that more people were going to have access to the state, there was going to be more accountability, etc. There was a new constitution in 1996, and go ahead with a couple of points there. Some of the neglected rights, like water, housing, health, and education all gain specific protections. This is different than Brazil in the sense that water is named in the Constitution as a human right. And this has been a very interesting and fraught constitutional provision. I can talk about that if you're interested, but I didn't put it in this presentation. Environmental law is linked explicitly to human rights in South Africa, so there's something there, although it's not quite as strong as the environmental law in Brazil. And all of these shifts, just like in Brazil, provided hope for broader social transformation. And just like in Brazil, the path has not been all that smooth. So what's going on in Johannesburg? The legacy of apartheid is really one of the biggest obstacles. And it manifests itself not just in class and race rifts, but in real geographic rifts. And this creates huge challenges, both for cleaning up environmental pollution, as well as for providing basic services like water and sanitation. The white areas have always been the ones that have received those services, and the townships are the ones that have never received those services. So it's immense, the challenges of trying to overcome those infrastructural deficits, which are expensive and politically difficult, and so there's a lot of problems there. There's also a real reluctance of state actors to challenge economic power. Sounds familiar. The economic power is what's different here, and that is the mining operations. It's very rare that you hear anyone criticize the mining sector. Even sometimes social activists won't criticize the mining sector because there are jobs there. And even though there's this incredible pollution, not everyone wants to jump on board to criticize an industry that's that polluting because it is seen to provide other kinds of benefits. So this is manifested within the state as well, with conflicting impulses there, where human rights and environment are not always well articulated with each other. And I think the biggest difference between Johannesburg and Sao Paulo is the capacity challenges that are faced by Johannesburg. You have to imagine that with the shift from a racist apartheid regime, where only whites held any administrative positions for the most part, where all the rules were designed to favor whites, where population was controlled to a degree that's hard to imagine, and where the enforcement was to enforce white privilege. All of these have changed. So you're dealing with a government that has brand new people who may not have the training or the institutional history. They are facing a new set of rules, new set of implementation. There's dramatic population movement, and there's still no good enforcement mechanisms that would cover the broad society. So there's real capacity challenges. But there have been some real changes, even if they're slow. So finally, the comparisons between the two cases. Ironically, so the social movement activity that is quite prevalent in South Africa is what is kind of needed in Brazil in order to push Brazil forward, while the state capacity that is very strong in Brazil is what is most needed in South Africa. But having said that, both countries share the conflicting mandates among human rights, private property, and environmental protection. It's these three things that into the future are going to be conflicting with each other. I think we might be, yeah. And I see this in both cases very clearly. And I think one of the key lessons for us in this is that we are all implicated in this. We all need to have an explicit conversation about how our production, our modes of production, our consumption habits and their implications impact the environment, inequality, and injustice. And I don't think there's any way around our own responsibility for that. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Okay, we'll start the Q&A now, and we have a microphone.
We have two.
We do have two microphones. So we have LaDawn on Skype, and I'll start the video for South Africa too. So first question.
This is a question regarding the positive right to water in South Africa. Can you discuss any kind of right of action or litigation that's occurring in South Africa to secure that right? How has water policy changed, if at all, with the amendment to the South African Constitution recognizing what I would characterize as a positive right to water?
So I think I heard the question. Is that for me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so the question was, how has the putting a human right to water in the Constitution had an effect on actual water policy?
And does it create a right of action as well?
And does it create a right of action as well, is asking.
What do you mean by a right of action?
Is it an enforceable right that can be secured through litigation if you're a plaintiff?
Okay, so there is a lot of litigation around the human right to water. There's a famous case that is, goes by a couple of different names. You might know it as the Johannesburg water case. You might know it as the Mazibuko case, or you might know it as the prepaid water pump case. But regardless, it is a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. It started in Johannesburg as a protest against prepaid water meters that were installed in poor communities. And the illegal issue at stake was whether there was a minimum human right to water. And what happened is, I won't go into all the gory details, but the community prevailed at the high court level, and then they prevailed again at the Supreme Court of Justice level, and then they lost at the Constitutional Court level. And what's interesting is the reason why that happened. In a nutshell, Johannesburg Water changed what it was doing over the course of litigation. And so after the first instance in the High Court, they changed their policy of free basic water to increase the amount of water that people would get before they'd be cut off. So when it went up to the higher courts found that Johannesburg Water had actually acted in the public interest. And the community won in the sense that they got a basic minimum of water, but they lost because they still could use prepaid water meters as a way of determining how to cut them off. And so there's still a lot of controversy over this because it hasn't been resolved how Johannesburg Water is supposed to provide water without cutting people off when they're destitute or they're poor. Because if they allow them to have water to a certain point and they haven't applied as being destitute, then they get cut off. And then so it's an unresolved legal question. So yes, the court cases are justiciable. The courts do hear the cases. There is some movement, but it's not the way that you would expect it to be. It's not a simple case where the judge says, do this, and then that's the end of the story.
Hello, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, my name's Rachel, and don't take this question the wrong way. I'm just asking a question that I think most people might want to know and don't want to ask you, but how does what you're doing out there help us out here?
Help you who?
Well, the water issues that we have in the United States? How does, I heard you say something earlier that made sense because you said what's going on out there impacts what people are doing out here. So I'm wondering, with you being out there and helping them with their water situation, what can you bring back, and is it going to help us with our water situations out here?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that, because I think that you may have misunderstood what I meant by the here and the there. What I meant was our consumption in the global north has an impact on the global south.
That's right.
And when we buy our trinkets and our phones and our cars, those resources come from somewhere else, often. And that somewhere else may be a marginalized community within the United States, or it might be a marginalized community outside of the United States. My point was, our consumption habits are having a negative impact globally. And there's, I mean, diamonds are something that you can readily understand because everybody's up in arms about diamonds and you shouldn't buy diamonds unless they're conflict-free, etc. But there are many, many other things that we consume that have the same negative impact. Not just on social issues, but on the environment. And my point was to link it to the mining issue. I don't know if you, I can't see the screen, so I don't know if you're looking at the mine waste there in South Africa, but these minerals that come from this very area that you're probably looking at feed into the products that we buy. So that's what I meant by the here and the there. So I guess I'm helping us by raising our awareness of how we can contribute to a more just world and sustainable world.
Do we have time for about one more question?
I'll take another crack at it. Regarding the Black Mesa water issue, can you speak a little bit to the role that activists in the area, particularly like the Black Mesa Water Coalition, had in bringing to light the educational issues regarding the coal pipe slurry and what other things that they might be doing and what other water issues that are coming out of that same area?
What's that?
Lots of light.
And you said particularly to the, what was the first thing you said?
The black,
I know it's for Black Mesa, the Water Coalition, you said particularly.
What role do you think that did the Black Mesa Water Coalition as an activist organization have any effect in resulting in the discontinuing the use of the coal pipe slurry, or what effect did they have at all in raising the educational awareness of that issue? And what other issues are going on in the Black Mesa area and Navajo Nation that are related to the aquifer use of water and energy creation?
Yeah. I think anybody who's interested in activism, and I've thought this often, if there were a way to for people to understand how effective the grassroots organizations that Black Mesa have been, they would be an incredible case study and model. They literally, I think the best example of that, yes, they were a part of the organizations that were working to have the Mojave generating station shut down and closure of the coal slurry pipeline and Black Mesa mine. More recently, Senator McCain-Kyle's Senate Bill 2109, which was supposed to be the water settlement bill. In the north, I was going to talk about this, but I ran out of time. And Elsa, if you can correct me if I leave some things out, but this was promoted to both the Hopi and the Navajo as bringing new sources of clean water to the tribal communities. The idea was that in the southern part of the sea aquifer, very deep aquifer, just kind of north of I-40, they were going to build 4 solar-powered desalinization plants, and they were going to create 3 pipelines up, I think 2 to the Navajo communities and 1 to the Hopi community. And the water settlement, everything that goes along with that. But along with that, there were a number of things that were going along. One, they were going to have to permit an aqua generation station and the mine. They're going to have to approve permit through 2044, just across the board. They could never hold the coal mine, the Peabody or federal government responsible for any potential impacts that may have had occurred in the past or that could occur in the future. And curiously, when this whole thing was going on, I was contacted by some colleagues, 4 colleagues at the University of Arizona, and they asked me what I thought about this particular program they had been approached with from the Bureau of Reclamation. They said they wanted them to do an impact study on this proposed project up there over the Sea Aquifer. And they said, well, we're going to build these 3 desalinization plants, and some of the water is going to be piped to tribal communities, but a lot of the water is going to be cleaned and then put back into the Little Colorado River. Because theoretically, in times of shortage, you understand that Arizona has the most junior rights in the Colorado River, so they will be the first to have their water source cut off. If that's Arizona's groundwater that's put into the Little Colorado River, that's theoretically Arizona's water that's augmenting the flow of the river. So if northern Arizona is constantly putting clean water into the Colorado River, then the CAP can always take that amount of water out of the Colorado River, even when they've had their junior rights pulled. When I talked to them in southern Arizona, they didn't know anything about this, the Navajo water settlement. They just thought it was a desalinization program. So in the south, this thing was promoted one way. In the north, it was promoted a completely different way. Regarding back to the activism that you're talking about, Black Mesa Water Coalition and others, by themselves, knocked down the Senate Bill 2109. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. Just their activism and by word of mouth and everything they did, and meetings they had, and educating the public was truly incredible. And Elsa was there and has been a part of this. Want to add something?
Unfortunately, we're actually out of time. Yeah.
I think we can let her speak though, no one will really oppose
I'm
it.
sorry, I didn't know there was. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm from Black Mesa. I live 3 miles from Peabody Coal, where they're operating. And there are several grassroots groups on Navajo, and we address uranium, coal mining, and the water, and the various issues that we have as far as that stem from all of these extraction activities. And back to your question about how participatory we are. We really are. And we're basically out of pocket. We're not sponsored by any large environmental group organizations, and we do our own research. And our people are, we use our laptops and our cell phones. That's how we won the fight against the SB 2109. And we collaborated with the Hopi tribe because we were in it together. And also, we got a copy of the settlement itself before, I probably shouldn't say this. we have ways, we got a way to, we were able to get our copy, and we deciphered the whole thing. And we just sat down and we went through the page by page, 400-page settlement. And with the tribe, the tribal government itself, these are grassroots folks, concerned people that we put together. And it was basically just written to continue Navajo Generating Station and also Peabody Mine, and however much water they needed. And that was basically why the settlement was written. It was not to benefit us. And it also made us waive, was supposed to make us waive our Aboriginal water rights forever. And so, and we couldn't quantify our water, we can't market our water. And it was just, it really handcuffed us, and we just thought this was so egregious what Kyle and McCain were doing. And so we fought them tooth and nail. And I think the just a few dollars that we were able to raise and get donations, probably about $4,000. But we were very tenacious. We had conference calls every Monday, and there was, about 15 of us. And so the various groups came together, and there was like the heads of the various groups came together, and there was like 15 of us on the conference calls every other Monday, and we formed a group called the Diné Water Rights. Diné means in our language, so we called ourselves Diné Water Rights. And so you have to do your own research. You have to stay ahead of the game, and I think that's one of the key things that we're able to do. We research, educate the communities, and back to when we were fighting the closure of Mojave Generating Station to stop the water, the coal slurry. A former Hopi chairman, Vernon Messiah, he took it upon himself to educate his people on his reservation, and then my brother Marshall went to the communities and really educated. He did his own graphs, and you have to become your own expert. And he researched and got as much information. That's before Daniel came along. The water, because we see it on the land, the springs have dried up where we used to take our sheep when we were smaller, and the places where we used to be able to get water, they're all gone now, and we see sinkholes forming for miles in length because the whole mountain starting to come down, because it's not, the water's not recharging. And so, just seeing and being observant, my brother saw all of this, and he took it upon himself and he made it his business to know. And it was very uncomfortable for our government, but he was there, and he was very tenacious, and so, and then he educated the folks, because our people are still, a lot of them cannot read or write, so he would explain everything in Navajo language to them, and he was able to collect 15 community resolutions, and he took that on horseback, 92 miles to the national capital. Gail Norton, at the time she was the Interior Secretary, was trying to press her tribe to renew that water lease for Black Mesa Mine for Peabody. Excuse me. And so through those resolutions, the people had said no, because they were now, informed and educated on what was going on with the aquifer. And so the Navajo Nation said no, the Hopi tribe said no, and at the same time, Grand Canyon Trust had filed a lawsuit against the Mojave Generating Station too, for which it was causing over Grand Canyon. So it was sort of like a collaboration of, the Hopi grassroots and Navajo grassroots and Grand Canyon Trust. So anyway, we are not, you can't let your guard down. We always have something else coming, and we have water rights coming back again too. And so, but it's always just to benefit someone else. When I'm down here, when I go to the EPA forums or public comments, I always tell the people down here, somewhere, somebody, somewhere far away is suffering, so we can enjoy,